Hey everyone, welcome to the Tom's Hardware Podcast for today, April 16th, 2024. As always, I'm Tom's Hardware Editor-in-Chief, Avram Pilch, joined by Associate Editor Les Pounder, Raspberry Pi expert Ash Hill, and our very special guest, Dave Jones, who works on Ubuntu for Raspberry Pi. And we're going to talk to him about what's going on with Ubuntu right now. What it has to do with compatibility with the Pi 5 and all that fun stuff. And then we've got some other cool things to talk about as well. So thank you so much for joining us again, Dave. It's wonderful to see you.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me.
What is the latest with Ubuntu for Pi?
Well, the big news is that we're finally getting an LTS on the Pi 5. So it was we previously had a sort of semi-official policy of whenever a new Pi or piece of hardware came out, we would support that on the current release and the current LTS release. But with the timing of the cycle being what it was and an LTS coming right up, it was decided in this case that the amount of effort that would be needed to backport support for the Pi 5 to Jammy would be excessive, especially given there's an LTS coming around the corner, as it were. So we went instead for adding LTS Pi 5 release for Noble on desktop and server. The big news there, though, is that this is going to be an ARM64 only release on the Pi for Noble. There will be no ARMHF images for the Pi, at least. That is not to say that ARMHF is going away as a supported architecture. It will still be there as a foreign architecture, just as you can install i386 DEBs on an AMD 64 machine, you can install ARMHF DEBs on an ARM64 machine. But if you're currently on an ARMHF image, say an Ubuntu ARMHF image on your Jammy, for example, you will not have a direct upgrade path. So that's something to be taken into account. Obviously, people on ARMHF can continue on Jammy for its lifespan. But for Noble, at least on the Pi, there won't be an ARMHF image itself. So yeah, that's the big headline news. The other headline news there on ARMHF is not Pi specific. That's more ARMHF generic, which is to do with the time T fixes, fixing the so-called year 2038 problem, which is fairly big news if you're on ARMHF and are expecting to use it far into the future. At some point, you're probably going to have to deal with dates in that range or beyond that range, which can cover many different forms of expiry dates on certificates, for example, or keys. And that will need fixing if you're going to have something that's supported that far into the future. And that indeed is one of the big changes that's coming with Noble, and it is a very big change. It's cost a considerable amount of work on the team to change the ABI in that fundamental way. Although it's technically only flipping a compiler switch, the effects ripple across the archive in many ways. So yeah, that's the big headline news is LTS for the Pi 5 finally, and ARMHF changes, whether that's time T or lack of direct images themselves. The other big one that's finally landed is we've got video acceleration on Firefox. This was something we were trying to get into Mantic and never quite managed. Nice. But now Mesa has got 23.2, I think was the version that was needed. That has landed, and it means that now if you go to the WebGL samples on a Pi 5 on Ubuntu's desktop, instead of getting a slightly paltry 2 frames a second, you get more like 60. Does
this affect YouTube playback at all, or it's a different thing?
Different thing, basically. I don't think I've seen some before and afters, but I couldn't really tell any difference. I think there might be less drop frames on the new one, but I don't think that's actually down to video acceleration. I think that's just down to having the new Mesa and the other effects of that upgrade. I don't think there's anything specific there, especially given that the Pi 5 itself does video decoding for H.264 and a couple of other codecs on the CPU rather than the GPU. So I don't think there's a major effect there. But yes, nonetheless, nice to have GL finally in Firefox, which is excellent. The other couple of bits were a couple of fairly major issues that we had early on in the kernel that we certainly saw with Mantic. You couldn't see the NVMe drive. So if you have, for example, Pimeroni's NVMe base on Mantic, you could flash Ubuntu onto there from Raspbios, but you couldn't flash it onto there from Ubuntu because Ubuntu wouldn't see the NVMe drive when booted off an SD card. That's now fixed in the kernel as well, so that will work out of the box in Noble. And the final bit there is a little script that I bashed together this cycle called Pemmican, which is to do with power monitoring. You're no doubt aware of the fun things to get power working properly on a Pi 5, having a 5 amp supply and such like. And that on Raspbios, if you don't have a 5 amp supply, it will say you don't have a 5 amp supply, you're going to get limited power on your USB ports, you can't boot off USB, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the panel that's used for that is tied into Wi-Fi and Raspberry, so we can't directly use that in the Ubuntu desktop, so we needed something slightly different. We also wanted something that would warn on the server images on the command line without a GUI interface, and obviously a GUI one for the desktop as well. So there is now a generic little package called Pemmican that I whipped up this cycle that deals with both of those scenarios. So it's a message of the day on the server images. When you log in, it will say you don't have a 5 amp supply or your last reset was caused by undervolt. And on the desktop, it will likewise warn with a standard system notification, but with the option to tell it to go away and not to bother you in the future.
Does it restrict the USB port output then if you have less than 5 amps or less than... Is it 5 amps or 4 amps?
5 amps is the required, and yes, that's a hardware restriction. Can be, well, hardware. It's a bootloader restriction, so you can override that with config text settings. But and that's mainly for the cases where you're backpowering Pi off GPIO and it can't negotiate with the USB, or doesn't realise that it actually has access to a 5 amp supply when it really does.
Right, makes sense. How about control of the new fan?
Yes, that is working. We actually fixed that back in Mantic. But yes,
I remember reporting that.
I remember last time when that came up, and and the first question was, "Why is the fan spinning fast?" And my answer was, "I have no idea. I haven't got one." But that's the way it goes. I mean, as system integrators, essentially, we got access to the board very early. But obviously at that time, though we could have access to the board, we couldn't necessarily have access to all the other bits because they weren't ready, including the fan and the power supply. So when the journalists got their pack with all the kit in it later, oh, we haven't seen those.
I mean, that's great. So are you able to now do more fine-tuning of how you want the fan to go? Because I know that's been something that I think we've wanted more of from Raspberry Pi OS.
Yes, I think there is potential there, but I haven't seen anybody actually doing it yet. The only reason I say there's potential is because I was the one that dived into the I think it was the stepwise fan driver to figure out what was going on Mantic. And it just turned out to be a badly rebased patch in that particular case. There's obviously several configuration knobs there that you can twiddle to change various things, and certainly in the PWM fan driver you can set the hysteresis levels that it will operate above and below. I haven't actually tried using those yet, though. So far it's just been, okay, it's working, move on to the next, whatever's broken next. But yeah, there are certainly configuration tweaks there that one could play with.
For folks who aren't familiar with LTS, can you explain why it's important that there's an LTS, why there's an LTS version?
Certainly, yes. And it's certainly important because it's where 99% of our users are, if we look at the download stats. So Ubuntu's release cycle is we release a new version of the operating system every 6 months. But every 2 years we do a, in inverted commas, special release, which is the LTS or long-term service release. So there's a long-term service release, 3 interim releases, then a long-term service release. And 3 interim releases and so on. The interim releases receive 9 months of support, and that's it. Some see them as experimental releases. We don't exactly see them as experimental, but they're certainly less important in some respects than the LTS releases. We feel a bit more free to experiment with some things in them, but they are still supported releases. Things will be backported and bugs fixed in them. But the LTS releases, as previously stated, are where the vast majority of our users are. They have 5 years of free support. So the current LTS is Jammy 22.04. That will have free support until 2027. He says, trying to do mental arithmetic. 5 years of free support. and then at least 5 years of paid support called ESM, Expanded Security Maintenance, which is typically a commercial offering, obviously. There is a free offering of ESM for 5 machines or less, or for Ubuntu community members for 50 machines or less. In other words, if you're a member of the Ubuntu community and contribute, then you have a vastly expanded free ESM quota, as it were.
Yeah.
I think there is currently discussion about a 12-year support program for the LTSs. Whether that's coming to ARM64, I don't know yet, but it is certainly being discussed for AMD 64. And then there are the other Pro programs that deal with, if people aren't aware, the Ubuntu archive is split into various what we call components. There's the main component, universe, restricted and multiverse, which we can ignore for these purposes. When we say things are supported, we mean main. So anything in the main component is supported. You file bugs, they will be fixed, they will be backported to old releases and so on. Things in universe, they are community supported, which means that if the community fixes it, we will make the uploads, we will sponsor and check and so on and so forth. But otherwise, they're not actively supported. However, the Pro offering now offers paid universe support as well, which vastly expands the number of packages that are supported over the lifetime of an LTS. So that's the important thing about having an LTS, is that it also kind of ties in with the Pi's own hardware lifecycle. Raspberry Pi themselves have said when they release a new board, they commit to producing that board or that model of board for at least 10 years in one form or another. And obviously having an operating system that mirrors that life cycle is important to some customers. If they can guarantee that they can get the same hardware and the same OS supported across that lifespan, that's a useful thing.
Yeah. Well, talking about hardware, obviously Ubuntu. What's Ubuntu 24.04 like on the Pi 5? I mean, you've been using it for a while, haven't you, on an NVMe?
Yeah. I mean, so this is now my main desktop over here. I use this one for video conferencing because it's quite a bit bigger. But when it comes to all the development work, as always, I've always done all my development work on the Pi. But my typical Pi that I did development work on before is a Pi 4, which is also sat on the desk just out of shot, unfortunately. But because it was a Pi 4, I tended not to run the desktop on there. I ran server on there, SSH'd into that, and I did my development work remotely. Yeah. But all the development work was still done on the Pi. This cycle I haven't had to do that. This cycle I've been running the desktop directly on the Pi 5. A little Pimeroni NVMe base under there. There's a 500 gig Samsung Evo, I think, on that. Nice. And that's running the desktop. And that has been where I've done all the development work, directly on the Pi. No SSHing, no nothing, just straight there. And that's a 4 gig one as well, not even an 8 gig.
Wow.
Yeah. It took a little tweaking of the swap file. The swap file, it's fine for normal use, but as soon as you get into compiling big things, you probably want some more. But it worked.
Are you using it at standard clocks? You haven't overclocked it or anything like that?
Nope. It has got the cooler on it, but no overclocking. No big RAM, just straightforward.
Have you tweaked NVMe to go to Gen 3 speeds?
Yes. And wow, that makes a difference, especially when you're dealing with all of the builds that we tend to do at a distro level. It tends to be a little bit different to building packages as an application maintainer. Yeah. As an application maintainer, you'll probably build the packages directly on your machine with whatever dependencies you happen to have lying around from whatever else you've been doing. It's not good enough when you're dealing at a distro level. You want a completely clean environment so you can guarantee there are no missing build dependencies. That means working with cheroots, containers, all sorts. Yeah. Building those is I/O intensive, and my God, does the NVMe make a difference there. Building cheroots on the Pi used to be a quite time-intensive process, and especially spinning up the cheroots to build things was noticeably slower than the PC by a considerable degree. And it turns out that an awful lot of that is not CPU, it's I/O. Once you've got a big fat I/O bus on there, it's almost PC-like. It certainly beats my laptop quite handily. Not that my laptop is anything to write home about, it's a Celeron, but I like my small cheap stuff.
I know what you mean. I mean, it's interesting. The Pi 5 now it is a low power ARM desktop, and with an OS like Raspberry Pi OS like Ubuntu, you have got a pretty competent machine to do 90% of all that we do on a machine.
Absolutely. Pretty much the only thing I now use the PC for is video conferencing. That's it. Or if I'm dealing with a PC package and I need the architecture. But
yeah,
other than that, that's it. And even video conferencing, I really ought to try just pushing the camera over here and showing it on there. Unfortunately, it's one of those cases where I need the USB port so much for sticking a serial probe in, or the oscilloscope, or whatever it may be that I need to shove into the USB ports, that having to unplug the camera all the time, it's just easier if I leave it on the PC. But I really ought to experiment with doing video conferencing on there instead.
Yeah, well,
were there any unexpected challenges that your team faced when developing the new LTS in regards to the new hardware specifications on the Pi 5?
Good question. Let's see. I mean, the biggest one was almost certainly the difference in the power structure. That previously you could just assume power's there and that's it. And if there's anything extra that's going to be needed, it's going to come through the kernel. And largely that is still true. You will still get undervolt warnings and overcurrent warnings through the kernel. But now there's a couple of extra bits in the device tree which you couldn't possibly do through the kernel, or, well, not yet at least. One of those warnings is where your last reset is caused by an undervolt, and the device tree will gets a value in a node saying your last reset was because your power supply sucks. Get a better power supply. And that's in the device tree. The kernel won't report it. That's one of the things that Pemmican will do. Everything else, though, is more or less through the kernel or UDEV or a couple of other bits. So most of that has been fairly plain sailing. One of the other... Oh, that's a good point, actually. Speaking of things that have gotten easier, Bluetooth got way easier in the last week when we discovered that the Pi Bluetooth package, which actually exists on both Ubuntu and Raspberry OS, has a whole bunch of the firmware blobs for the Broadcom Bluetooth driver in it. Yeah. No longer necessary. I threw it all out this week. Emptied the package completely, and Bluetooth still works on everything, or everything that we support. Admittedly, I haven't checked the Pi 0W because we don't support that specific one. The 02W, no problem. 3A+, 3B+, 4, 5, no problem at all. So I need to poke a ticket upstream to Raspberry and say, you might be able to empty out your package too, because it's all now in the kernel. Though they're on kernel 6.6, we're on 6.8, so there's a possibility that maybe they need a later kernel. But yeah, either way, things are getting easier. One of the things I have to say about Raspberry Pi is that they're fantastic at upstreaming things. An awful lot of hardware vendors will come out with patches for the kernel or for some piece of software, and then that's it. There's no significant attempt to upstream it, and therefore it becomes a matter of maintaining those patches as successive versions of that software come along, and that just makes maintenance incredibly hard for a long-running distro or an LTS release. It's fantastic when the hardware vendor makes significant efforts to upstream things, and Raspberry Pi have been quite diligent in doing that, especially with the kernel.
That's brilliant. But it leads on quite nicely to what Raspberry Pi is famous for. And take a swig of tea before I say this. The GPIO. So that's been a bugbear on the Pi 5. So our Pi GPIO still wasn't there. We couldn't access GPIO pins in the old way if it just bit banging. Now we have to go for the Rpy 1. And it just went a bit wrong for a while. How is it going now?
Okay, so this is something I have been banging on about for years now, basically saying that the state of affairs with GPIO is not going to last. It cannot last. The kernel upstream don't like what the various drivers were doing for accessing the GPIOs, and besides which, it was a brittle situation because there was no abstraction of the hardware. If you're banging away at the registers of the hardware, which is what was happening with the GPIO drivers, you are dependent on those registers staying as they are, and that's not going to happen as you move successive hardware models. So this situation was bound to come to a head sooner or later. I sort of forced it to come to a head in Ubuntu a bit earlier, I think in Luna. I put out a blog post saying, okay, this is an interim release. Oh, no, it was Kinetic, that's right. it was just after we'd done Jammy. Jammy is an LTS, long-term service release, 22.04. So we said, let's not break things there, because LTS. But the next one's an interim. Let's try breaking stuff here and see how much pain we're in for. And so in Kinetic, I said, okay, we'll turn off sysfs, which is the part of the old infrastructure that the GPIO drivers were relying upon. Let's see what happens. And not much seemed to happen, but then, as I say, 99% of our users are on LTS, so perhaps there wasn't enough engagement of GPIO users in that cohort. Nonetheless, I started developing a shim called Rpy LGPIO, which emulates Rpy GPIO's API. So if you're using Rpy GPIO, there should be no difference in the API. We'll come on to just what none means in a bit, because there's always differences, of course there are. But it sits on top of the new kernel interfaces. Why are there new kernel interfaces? Partly because new hardware, as I say, as new hardware moves on, the registers change, you've got to change with it. But it's a bit more serious than that in the Pi 5. Previously, in the Pi 2, 3, so on and so forth, all the other Pis, GPIOs have always been controlled directly from the SoC. So the SoC itself is driving those GPIOs. As your process gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the voltages involved on the SoC get smaller and smaller as well, but the voltages on the GPIO are staying the same. Sooner or later, you can't sustain that, and it's got to move onto a chip with a bigger process. And that's exactly what's happened with the Pi 5. The Pi 5's GPIOs are no longer controlled by the SoC, they're controlled by the new RP1, the South British sort of chip off to the side, down at the other end of a PCIe lane. This is much better in many respects, but it does mean a fundamental change in the way that the GPIOs are driven, and that means that the traditional libraries absolutely will not work. And it's all very well people saying, well, Pi should maintain them. It's not a question of maintaining, it's a question of rewriting completely from the ground up, or doing the sensible thing and using the kernel interface. But that comes with trade-offs. The kernel interface is much, much stricter than just banging on the registers where you get to do whatever you like because you're in control of the hardware, and damn the kernel trying to touch the same registers you're touching. You just sort of both touch them and hope it works out. And for the most part, it kind of did, but that's not going to happen anymore. The new interfaces are much stricter. They demand you cannot have two processes that allocate or use the same GPIO at the same time. For many things this won't matter, but for other things it's absolutely critical. Imagine if you have a web server which is multi-process, so every request that comes in spawns a new process. If you are touching GPIOs in those processes, previously you could assume, oh, well, we'll just have both of them touching the same set of registers, and it'll work. Ish. But it'll work for the most part, especially if it's a low traffic website that only has one user, as you might well do for a Pi in a house doing something. But that's not going to work anymore because you can't have two processes allocating the same GPIO. Completely broken. So there you have to change, whether that's to a threading model, ASIC model, whatever it may be, but the change is necessary. And unfortunately, as much as I'd love to paper over those differences, I can't. Rpy LGPIO builds on top of LGPIO, on top of the kernel interfaces. The kernel interfaces are what demand you cannot share processes. Nothing I can do about that. So even if you move, you have an existing user of Rpy GPIO, you move them over to the new library, there will be differences I can't paper over. I have tried to document those as best I can in the Rpy LGPIO documentation. There is a whole differences chapter saying this will break, that will break, this is different, so on and so forth. Debouncing is another thing that changes fundamentally, because LGPIO debounces in a very, very different way to Rpy GPIO. There's some pretty graphs in there of how they debounce differently, and when you will see the edge detection in each library and how that will change. Nonetheless, yes, there will be changes. We have tried to make the transition as easy as possible, but for a long, long time it has been broken. And that is quite substantially my fault. Rpy LGPIO is simple, it's just pure Python, so the wheel's been around for that for ages now. Years at this point, I think. But it depends on LGPIO, and LGPIO is not easy to build across Python versions for PyPy. various reasons for this, partly down to the structure of the code, but that much is easy to work around. The bigger problem is that this depends on kernel headers that are up to date, because the GPIO chip interface, the one that we need to use, the version we need to use, is quite recent. Because it's quite recent, you need up-to-date kernel headers. But wheels for PyPy are built on what is called the Many Linux standard. The Many Linux standard exists to promote compatibility, and it does so by using very old things. Old compilers, old glibc, old everything. As old as they reasonably can to ensure as wider compatibility, which is very sensible. But in this case means it won't work to compile it because the kernel headers are too old. So there was the first stumbling block. Well, actually, there was about the third stumbling block, but anyway, there were various stumbling blocks that had to be overcome. And with all the other distro work going on, I never found the time to do it until very, very recently. Very recently, I finally managed to spend an entire weekend building wheels for LGPIO for Python versions 3.9 through 3.12, I think, on AMD 64, ARM 64, and ARM HF. They are all now up on PyPy, which means finally you can just pip install Rpy LGPO. It should pull in LGPIO, and everything should just work. Should.
Well, that's a very important public service, so we really appreciate it. Oh, so speaking of things you can do while you're experimenting with pins, Les, you've got a bunch of new toys. What do you have in front of you?
I've got a plethora of Pi stuff. I like saying plethora; it's a nice word. So Cyron very kindly sent me the EDU Pico, or EDU Pico, just here, and it comes in a rather nice box, which I've got off camera here. If I go to overhead, you get a nice big cardboard box, but what do you get in the box? Well, obviously, you get the toy to play with, and you get an absolute ton of educational resources. So quick reference cards, which are upside down. There we go. Explaining how to use the board, how to use the software. It's all pre-wired. And we get a guidebook, which takes us through like a manga cartoon of each project. I think it's about 5 or 6 projects in it. And it is just a Raspberry Pi Pico W. There it is. We use a banana for scale as a pointing tool. There's your Pico W. You could use a normal Pico if you want, but Pico W is the best one, so you've got Wi-Fi. And we've got loads of sensors. So dotted around my table here, I've got all different Cyron boards. This is the latest one, the new toy to play with. So we've got USB relay. So we can control a USB device and give it power. So I've got a light here. Voltage input terminal between 3.6 and 6 volts. LiPo charging and LiPo power. So we can power the entire board from LiPo if we want. We've got 2 motor controllers. I think it's one of the MX motor controllers. Can't remember the exact number, but it's one of the good ones that's used on the Maker Drive, which I've got here. This is why I've got these handy props, because it basically has all these toys dotted around in the center. We've got servo contacts here, so we connect up to 4 servos. Micro SD card, so we can log data. We have got headphone output, buzzer, potentiometer. We've got a microphone, a MEMS microphone. They're quite decent. So you can pick up your voice as a sound level. It's not going to record your voice, but it can hear how loud something is, and use it as a trigger. A lovely OLED screen, which at the minute is just showing some data I'm going to tell you about in just a second. We've got a color, gesture, and distance sensor. RGB LEDs, because we need NeoPixels. Buttons. We've got temperature sensor. And we've got all of these white or off-white connections just around the board. They're Grove connections, which use wires like this to connect up. So you can wire up external boards if you want, or you can break this apart. But as it is right now, that's all pre-wired. I don't have to do any soldering at all. I can put this in front of a kid and give them just basic instructions, those reference cards, and they can make a project. So I'm going to show you how it's all wired together. I've got at the moment a light sensor, which is just reading the light from above my desk. And it's saying it's at 86% right now. It's all nice and bright. But if I just put the banana for scale over the light sensor, it'll go darker. And the light level's now 5. And you can see the light has turned on and the fan has turned on. So we've got a light control switch. If I take banana away. After 5 seconds, it'll check the light level and it's at 93. So it's just a way of getting kids interested in electronics and coding without saying to them, here's a soldering iron. Come on, let's do this. Because when you're a kid, soldering is cool, but it's also very difficult. Bill, good question, mate. How much is the board? Where can we buy them from? It's about $50 to $60 at the moment. It's from Cyron Direct. UK stockists will be coming soon. So the usual places like Pimoroni, the Pi Hut, that sort of thing, they'll have them in stock, which will be a bit cheaper to buy from because of the import costs. But you can get it direct from Cyron. Good little board. I'm playing around with it, and they're going to have a full review very soon. And yes, kids do find solderless breadboard difficult at times. So do I sometimes. I can tell you stories about times I wired up stuff and thinking, why is it not lighting up? And it's like, well, because Les, you put it in the wrong row. Done that. But yeah, be a full review coming soon on this.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, speaking, it is tough. Next week, at our Les, I don't think you know this. Ash definitely doesn't know this. Dave definitely doesn't know this. Next week we're having Bring Your Kids to Work Day at the office. Les doesn't work out of our New York office, so he wouldn't know about it. But I actually might need a little help with this. I volunteered to do run one of the activities with the kids, which is having giving everybody a breadboard with like a 9-volt battery and some lights and resistors and maybe a buzzer to teach them about circuits. I would say let's have a microcontroller, but then I'd have to get everybody a microcontroller that's soldered and like a Pico that's soldered and like a computer to program it on. And I think that might be a step too far. So I'm just going to show them like how to create a simple circuit.
A good way to do that is if you can get your hands on some jelly babies and some paper clips, you can get the female to male header wires, straighten out a paper clip, put it into the female end, put it into a jelly baby, get another one, do the same thing, put it in the other end of the jelly baby, so they're just near to touching. Complete the circuit for an LED, a buzzer, whatever. And then when the kid squishes a jelly baby, it connects to 2 wires and it makes a noise.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, it's messy as hell, but it's great fun for the kids.
Oh, I did
and
not.
you can eat it.
I wouldn't eat it after that, but yeah.
No.
I have to find out how that's done because jelly babies, we don't normally eat them here, but in America, I guess maybe a gummy bear is the same thing.
Gummy bear will do. Haribo, anything like that will do. As long as it's clear and squishy, it'll work.
Yeah, but hey, jelly baby's the choice of Doctor Who, so who's to complain? Well, if we have just a minute, speaking of kid stuff, I just want to give everybody a quick little slideshow and ask if they how many of these things they recognize. So this past weekend, I took my son to the Vintage Computer Festival here in New Jersey, and we took some pictures. And so, first of all, this was a bunch of old CPUs. How many of these have you used?
How many are in my loft?
So what I thought was interesting here was this was I think the first AMD x86 chip, a 286.
I've got a 387DX co-processor chip in the loft. I know that for definite.
Here's like a little expansion of that.
I think the first PC I touched was a 286.
Yeah, I had an 8086. This is a rare one. This is a Xerox computer.
Oh, nice.
1981 with a GUI years before the Lisa and the Mac. This is somewhat of a shameful chapter in computer history.
Yeah.
The PC Junior, IBM's attempt at a family-friendly PC that wasn't fully PC compatible and had a terrible keyboard. I didn't realize this thing existed. This is a luggable TI computer with a color screen.
The color is unusual. I remember luggables very like that way back in my early days at IBM. They had luggables with a plasma display.
Right.
Was...
I have some pictures of those too, but I find that kind of wild that this is like a color one. This is my son with a very well-known computer, the Commodore PET. This is the original PET, not like any of the revisions, because it has the really tiny keyboard.
Yeah, the micro gamma font on the keyboard as well.
Do I see a TRS-80 in the background there as well?
Oh yeah. We'll get to, so there was some TRS-80s. I didn't know all about Cosmac before I went to the show, but apparently a lot of people like to emulate retro boards with the Cosmac VIP and the Cosmac ELF, which were hobbyist board computers in the 70s. Here's a digital terminal. Here is a Data General terminal, notable for having the keycaps that I have today. I have replica keycaps of those that I absolutely love. This is some type of a Hackintosh that someone was showing. They had a lot of Hackintoshes there.
I love it. The abomination.
Somebody had, this is upside down, but somebody had Linux OS as their license plate, so I took a picture of that. Someone else had an electric car that said plugs in. I'm sure you all recognize this fellow.
Yep.
Douglas Adams, for those.
We all got a towel.
I don't know what computer this was, actually, but I don't think it was anything special. This is a very rare computer, a B-Box, made to run BEOS, and I believe it was a PowerPC chip. Here's a K-Pro, another luggable from the early 80s PC. Osborne, famous for the phrase Osborning yourself, which is to tell people that you have a better model coming out, and so people don't buy the current one. This here is a TRS-80 single piece that was running some type of a Star Trek The Motion Picture demo. This may be more familiar to less than to me. BBC Micro from 1981.
Yeah.
Echoes of my childhood.
Right. This was my first computer that I owned, and I can't say it was very good, but this is a TI-99 4A, which was sort of a meh, not as good as a Commodore.
I like the keyboard on that one, though. It's a nice keyboard.
It was an okay keyboard. It was comparatively. This here is the Junior again. Somebody had made it say hello over and over again. This is a regular IBM PC, first gen. No surprise there.
I used one of them in my first job.
This here is a really old laptop with a red screen.
That's plasma.
Plasma. Yeah.
Yes. So here's your TRS-80 again, Model 1 with a tape. More PET. More pictures of PET. I've never heard of this Samson 1. Has anybody else here heard of Samson 1?
No.
Me neither. Or ADM 3A. So
nearly a Johnny Ives case.
Here's another Atari computer I'd never heard of. Late Atari,
Amiga.
1991. HP terminal. No shocker there that they had some terminals. I didn't get a really good picture of this, but this was a Univac that they had, or they had a Univac. Maybe this wasn't the Univac. They had a Univac there. This, I don't know what it is, but it was called the Triad, which sounds much more exciting than it is. This here is something I'm sure a lot of people recognize. An Apple II Plus.
Yeah.
Anyone recognize this Amiga game?
The game?
It is called Leander. Somebody told me, told me it was called Leander. It looks cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it.
I had a 500 way back when.
So
Yeah, I remember the name Leander, but I can't picture that game.
So this here is some PC running Microsoft Neptune, which later which was, I think, an unreleased version of Windows that was going to be Windows ME, and then they just came out with Windows ME. Here is a whole bunch of Hackintoshes that they have, but you'll notice they're all old Windows laptops, and they're all running OS X, not the most recent Mac OS.
I really hope Gadgetoid's watching this right now because he loves his old Sony Bio stuff. He's mad for it.
So I don't know how they did it, but they had that. Here's somebody running on a modern PC running Haiku, which is an open source version of BEOS. My favorite long forgotten OS is BEOS because I love the UI.
Yeah.
And it had, and my son was excited because they had somehow managed to play Minecraft on it. Another Hackintosh, everyone's favorite iMac. They were actually selling iMacs for like $250. This here is something interesting. This was a Pioneer Macintosh clone.
Yeah.
Who knew that Pioneer? I didn't know that Pioneer made a Macintosh clone.
That's only because I watched Mac84's video on this.
And it had like its own like color webcam, and it could control a Laserdisc player.
Yeah.
So
that's cool.
More of the BEOS machine here. This was someone just showing off the studio display, which was one of the first LCD monitors. I remember I really wanted one of these, even though I didn't like Macs. I liked the screen. So they were playing Nintendo on it. This was a fascinating little thing here where someone had taken this. This, by the way, seems like something we would feature on our show. Someone had used an Arduino or something to convert this old cable box. I don't know if you folks had these cable boxes like this in the UK, but an old cable box like this, and it actually is showing old TV programs on it. Somehow, I think they must be recordings when you flip the channels. Obviously, they had a few dot matrix printers there. So here is a Raspberry Pi Amiga. Someone had used a Raspberry Pi to create an Amiga emulator. No shocker there.
Yeah.
I think this was the Raspberry Pi Amiga, but they also had this little thing here. Maybe this was it. This was also an Amiga emulator.
That looks like the Amiga or the 500, which came out about 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think this is the one you buy, right?
Yeah, it's about $100 for a Linux SPC with an Amiga emulator on it. I think it's running like AmiKit or something like that, or AmiBerry.
Yeah, so it must be that maybe that is the Raspberry Pi one.
Possibly.
So they had a lot of stuff running Amiga OS. That's a Mac, 1984 Mac, and a Lisa PDP-8 on a chip. This was a printer that was, I think, a daisy wheel printer because it wasn't showing dots for dot matrix, and it was printing out pictures. I thought was kind of a cool thing.
That's cool.
Off of this VT105 terminal. I love the terminals. That's always one of my favorite things to see. This person here was from a computer museum in, I think, in the Netherlands, and they had some Philips computers I'd never heard of before that you could play games on.
I wonder if the Philips computers were MSX.
Maybe. This here was a Heathkit, which I'd never heard of before, but I think this is also made by Radio Shack. Another Heathkit, plasma screen. Is it plasma screen or you say phosphorus screen?
I guess phosphorus, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, I love the phosphorus screens. So here's somebody with an old Commodore 64 and an Atari. Nothing you haven't seen before, but I want to get a picture of it. This person here had all of these boards that they had used to emulate the Cosmac ELF and the Cosmac VIP, and some of them were using Arduino. So here's one that's using an Arduino with little
Oh,
tiny
nice.
buttons instead of keys to emulate a Cosmac VIP. And they had a real Cosmac VIP somewhere on here. And these were all things that people had made with Arduino. This is some kind of Polish computer, I think, that was made with a Cosmac. This is an original Cosmac ELF. This is some kind of an replica board that someone had made. That was kind of cool. All the Cosmac stuff. Somebody had Frogger on a computer. Who owned a joystick like this? I did.
I didn't. I've used it, but I didn't like them.
I'm not saying they were good.
Yeah,
Now I'm getting. This is actually in reverse order of when I took these, and some are more interesting than others. So you might recognize this if you watched our show a few weeks ago. Oscar, who makes these, was there. And so we got to see this in person. And he showed us it was basically running Raspberry Pi OS, but running some old, I think, MIT operating system on it. This is a really old, dirty-looking Tandy computer. Now, this to me was the most interesting part. There were a whole bunch of computers from Brazil and Argentina that were Apple and Commodore knockoffs from the 80s. So this one here is the TK3002E, which is a Brazilian Apple knockoff. And the guy actually opened them up to show me that the boards are not made by Apple, but are the same as Apple boards. Here is this. You think this is a legit Apple, but it was made by Milmar, whoever that is. This one here has something no Apple II ever had, to my knowledge, which is a numeric keypad. And it had Portuguese letters for use in Brazil. So I thought that was pretty cool. Here, I think this is some type of a Sinclair Z.
Spectrum knockoff, yeah.
Spectrum knockoff.
And an 81, a ZX81 knockoff to the left of it.
Yeah. I think this was an Atari knockoff, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, it's got to be. It's like an 800, something like that.
Yeah, like a 1200. So that was the Brazil side of the table, but the Argentina side was more interesting because the guy who was there said that the reason they had to do these is because in Argentina at the time, they had a law that said they couldn't import computers. So they would import the parts and then have a local company assemble them. So like here's one that's like a Sinclair one.
Yeah.
Here you're going to see this is one of their multi-cartridges for the cartridges which had like multiple games on them for their own Atari knockoff called the Froggy Jr. And the Froggy Jr. came with this as a joystick, which apparently does not have a PCB inside, but metal, so that it touches the metal. And it looks very different than a regular Atari joystick if you've ever used one. And this is what the Froggy Jr., which is the Atari 2600 knockoff, looks like. These are Commodores that were like Dreen was an Argentinian company that bought the parts and produced their own Commodore 64. I thought that was a fascinating story. This is another Spectrum ripoff. You can sort of see the box here for the Dreen. They also apparently use a different version of PAL. I think was it like PAL V or something? So it couldn't have the same outputs as PAL or NTSC. There is the compact luggable that everybody remembers as maybe the first portable computer. But of course, my son was most excited to see Windows 98 because to him that's old.
On a libretto, isn't it?
Yes.
They were nice machines.
So that's the whole story. Anyway.
Oh, and you went past the 101 then. I love that machine.
Yeah. Oh, the Tandy?
Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely form factor.
Yeah, they didn't have it working though. A friend of mine who lives in Florida claims that he has like four. Says he has four of them in his attic. Anyway, didn't mean to bore you with all of that, but I thought it would. I thought I would show you my field trip there.
It's bringing back PTSD of typing on the Spectrum's keyboard.
Yeah, no jokes. Like, who wants to relive that? Who wants to relive that? What they didn't have there, which I was very surprised because I would have loved to shown my son, was an Atari 400, which had its own really horrifyingly bad keyboard, completely flat, like typing on a microwave.
Yeah, like the 81, the ZX81 had that. Oh.
Yeah, so really bad. But I want to thank Dave for showing up and coming today and sharing his wonderful
boring you with GPIO bits
and putting up with our slideshow. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening, and we will be back next week on April 23rd at the usual time to talk more tech. See everybody soon. Bye.